You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hey everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for February 26th, 2021. This week, COVID risk factors, post-COVID CMR studies, and 2 important obesity trials. First, brief news on COVID. It's all good news. Cases continue to decrease. And FDA gave a nod to the J&J vaccine, which is spectacular because it is one shot and it does not require special refrigeration for shipment. So let's get right into the studies. The first is an association study with COVID hospitalizations. A group at Tufts University, led by Megan O'Hearn and Darius Mozaffarian, have published a paper looking at the association of cardiometabolic conditions in COVID-19 hospitalizations. Now, this was a complicated mathematical simulation type of paper in which they assessed the population attributable fraction, PAF, for conditions like obesity, diabetes, heart failure for COVID-19 admissions. The PAF, or population attributable fraction, is an epidemiologic measure used to assess the public health impact of certain exposures in populations. My simple thinking on it is this: the number or proportion of cases, here hospitalizations for COVID-19, that would not occur if that risk factor would be eliminated. Now, the main findings of this paper will not surprise you, but the numbers are striking. Among greater than 900,000 U.S. COVID-19 hospitalizations, nearly 2/3 were estimated to be attributable to 4 cardiometabolic conditions, that is, preventable if these conditions had not been present. The top 3 risks were obesity, 30%, hypertension, 26%, and diabetes, 20%. Journalist Sue Hughes has excellent coverage of this paper that was published in the Journal of the American Heart Association. Senior author Mozaffarian made an obvious statement to Sue. He said, quote, "We are closing businesses and stopping people from seeing their loved ones, but we are not telling them to lose weight and do some exercise. We should be focusing public health messages on reducing diabetes and obesity as a means to be reducing severe COVID disease." Now, I follow COVID-19 very closely, and it's not common to hear this message from public health leaders. You hear about mannequins and how many masks to wear, you hear about how many feet to stay apart, and you hear about COVID variants. But if indeed there is causality in Mozaffarian's associations, think about what a PAF means. 30% of COVID-19 admissions would not have occurred without obesity, 26% without hypertension. These are really, really big numbers. Anyways, this paper relates to the last 2 papers I will discuss on obesity. Next topic is COVID and the heart. The University College London team, led by Dr. Graham Cole and Mariana Fontana, have published a very nice study of CMR scans in 148 patients who were sick enough with COVID-19 to have had troponin elevations. The European Heart Journal published this paper that focused on MRI scans that were done at a median of 68 days after discharge. Now, right off the bat, you like this study because it focuses on a homogeneous patient population enriched with people who could have cardiac involvement. Well, that's different from the previous CMR post-COVID studies. And here, we have to think about Bayes' theorem again. Since the University College team are testing people more likely to have abnormalities, you'll feel more confident with the results. The analogy, of course, is you have greater confidence in a positive stress test in a patient with risk factors and typical chest pain than from the general population with no symptoms. Trials and studies, like medical tests, update our prior beliefs. The control arm here included 40 patients who had CMRs done for clinical reasons before the pandemic. So they were matched for age and gender, diabetes, hypertension. And in addition, the authors had 40 healthy volunteer scans that were performed to derive normal ranges for native T1 and T2. So let's look at who these patients were. Average age 64, BMI 29, half with hypertension, 1 in 5 with coronary disease, 30% diabetes, and 24% smoking. So right there, without COVID, you would expect the CMR to find stuff. So let's dig into the results. 1 in 4 CMR scans had infarcts or ischemia patterns. 1 in 4 had a myocarditis-like pattern of injury. The authors emphasize myocarditis-like because they say that we don't yet know what is causing this, but it looks similar to myocarditis we are familiar with before COVID. About a third of patients with myocarditis-like picture had findings consistent with active inflammation. However, biventricular function was preserved in patients with myocarditis and no different to those without myocarditis. Some CMRs had a mixture of infarct, ischemia, and myocarditis-like findings. Troponin levels were not predictive of the diagnosis of myocarditis, and there was no difference in mean native T1 in the remote myocardium between controls and COVID-19 patients, but both groups had higher T1 than healthier volunteers. There was no difference in T2 in the remote myocardium between COVID-19 patients and controls. And 50% of these CMR scans had no major abnormality. The authors really thought this was important because even in the group who had been very sick with raised troponins, it was common to find no evidence of heart damage. Now, discussion points. COVID mostly affects people with cardiovascular risk factors, so ischemia and infarcts on CMR are not surprising. The findings on CMR suggest that in at least some cases, the troponin elevations may have been due to type 2 demand greater than supply MI with these very sick patients. While myocarditis was present in small numbers, it was not associated with regional wall motion abnormalities nor left ventricular dysfunction, and it was limited to 3 or less segments in the vast majority. These CMR observations would confer a favorable prognosis, the authors write, despite the fact that these patients were very ill. The study differs a lot from the Puntman et al. Study that garnered 900,000 page views and nearly shut down U.S. collegiate sports. Recall that Puntman used T1 and T2 measures to diagnose myocardial disease in 2/3 of patients recovering from even mild COVID. Now, the University College London findings. Now, this was a multi-center study of much sicker patients. They found that both native T1, which may be elevated in fibrosis or edema, and T2, which is more specific for edema, were within normal limits in the vast majority of patients, 87% for T1 and 97% for T2. The University College London authors write that, quote, "We believe our data challenge the hypothesis that chronic inflammation, diffuse fibrosis, or long-term LV dysfunction is a dominant feature in those surviving COVID-19, and I would agree." And another point, which journalist Deborah Beck brought out in her news story, is a quote from Dr. Logan Finn from the Cardiovascular Path Institute in Gaithersburg, Maryland. He noted that it would be better if researchers would stop using the term myocarditis altogether to describe clinical or imaging findings in COVID-19. Finn emphasized that MRI can't diagnose myocarditis. It's a specific diagnosis that requires, ideally, finding histology. Finn says this, of course, because typical myocarditis involves usually an echocardiogram that shows a wall motion abnormality, an ECG with marked abnormalities, enzyme elevations, and then normal coronaries. A true clinical myocarditis is usually not subtle. Now, these reassuring findings from the University of College London group doesn't say this is the end. COVID-19 CMR finding studies can stop. We definitely should do more studies, but these observations hardly suggest a routine clinical role of using CMR after COVID. Final point, now move on. I noticed a number of commenters on a news story complaining about the headline. As a writer, this makes me mad as a hornet. I'd say read the darn story. Miss Beck's coverage was superb. She reported the data, relayed the author's reassuring nature of the experiment, and got useful comments from an outside expert. It's what we want in journalism. Okay, next topic is obesity. 2 randomized controlled trials, one in New England, the other in JAMA, have found that once-weekly injectable glucagon-like peptide-1 agonist semaglutide induces significant weight loss in patients with obesity. GLP-1 agonists stimulate glucose-dependent insulin release, reduce glucagon, slow gastric emptying, and promote satiety. Preclinical studies suggest that weight loss with this class may result from its effects on GLP-1 receptors that mediate direct and indirect effects on the brain areas involved in regulation of appetite in the hypothalamus and hindbrain. In 2017, FDA approved semaglutide for glycemic control in type 2 diabetes. In 2020, FDA approved semaglutide for MACE reduction in patients with type 2 diabetes and heart disease based on data from the SUSTAIN-6 trial. The makers of semaglutide, Novo Nordisk, have undertaken a series of placebo-controlled trials called the STEP 1 through 4 trials, specifically targeting obesity in non-diabetic patients. New England Journal of Medicine published the first STEP 1 trial. This was about 2,000 patients, age 46, BMI 38, 73% female. Randomization was 2-to-1 to either semaglutide injection once weekly or placebo. Both groups got lifestyle intervention and counseling to adhere to a reduced calorie diet and increase physical activity. The co-primary endpoints were the percent change in body weight and weight reduction of at least 5%. The duration of the trial was just 68 weeks, so a little more than a year. And the results were that it was a landslide victory. You don't even need statistics. The percent decrease was minus 14.9% in the semaglutide group, as compared with just minus 2.4% with placebo. And far more patients in the semaglutide arm achieved 5, 10, and 15% loss of body weight. Now, unlike most cardiovascular outcomes trial, you can drive a truck through these plots of data. The curves are markedly different. And as you would expect, physical functioning and cardiometabolic indices such as blood pressure, hemoglobin A1C, glucose, LDL, and triglycerides all favored the semaglutide group. Now, there was a cost to these gains. More patients in the semaglutide group had serious adverse events, 9.6 per 100 patient years versus 6.4 per 100 patient years in placebo. And adverse events causing discontinuation of the drug were also greater in the semaglutide arm. Most of the adverse events were GI, nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, constipation. Gallbladder-related disorders were also more common in the semaglutide group. Now, JAMA published the other smaller Step 3 trial of this series. This was 611 patients, also randomized 2-to-1 semaglutide versus placebo injections once weekly. These were a similar young age of 46, mostly female, and the same BMI of 38. And again, the duration of this trial was also 68 weeks. Same co-primary endpoint of percent weight loss and number who achieved 5% or more body weight reduction. The big difference in this trial was more aggressive lifestyle interventions in both groups. Patients in this trial received more counseling visits, meal replacements, and meetings with dietitians. And the results were similar. The mean body weight change from baseline was 16% for semaglutide, but up to almost 6% for placebo. The difference here was minus 10.3 percentage points. Now, this is a hugely significant difference, though you notice better weight loss in the placebo group in this study. The mean loss was nearly 6% versus 2.4% in the first New England trial. And it was the same story with numbers who lost 5, 10, and 15%. Far more of those in the semaglutide arm achieved these levels. And it was the same story with adverse events. GI side effects occurred in 83% of those on semaglutide and 63% of those on placebo. The authors of the JAMA paper noted that inclusion of intense behavioral therapy plus an 8-week low-calorie diet ultimately may not contribute additional weight loss beyond that achieved by the semaglutide and less intensive lifestyle intervention. Okay, some discussion points. Now, I look at a lot of studies that have modest effect sizes, and these are not modest effect sizes. These are big differences. I mean, a 15% weight loss in a person weighing 300 pounds is 45 pounds. That is both statistically significant and clinically significant. And obesity is a major health problem, especially in the United States. If sustained, this sort of weight loss will surely lead to better cardiovascular outcomes through reduction in blood pressure, lipids, inflammation, and better physical functioning. The pandemic distracts us, but it is worth remembering that heart and vascular disease remain a leading cause of morbidity and mortality. And despite huge gains in medical technology, we have TAVR and MitraClips, the average lifespan of adults in the U.S. has not budged one bit, and obesity has to play a role in this. Now, a once-weekly injection is also nice because it could improve adherence over a daily pill. The effect size here is larger than seen in other GLP-1 agonist trials like with liraglutide, though it is hard to compare different trials. Journalist Marlene Busco has excellent coverage of both of these studies, and I learned from one of her reports that there is an ongoing liraglutide versus semaglutide trial in obesity. Okay, now let's do the concerns and limitations. First, this quote from the New England Journal paper. Quote, "The sponsor, Novo Nordisk, designed the trial and oversaw its conduct. Authors participated in drafting the manuscript, but were assisted by a sponsor-funded medical writer. Also, 3 authors of the New England Journal paper were industry employees." This does not negate the findings, but it is something to make note of. On Twitter, trial expert Dr. Sanjay Kaul wrote that this is an increasing trend in recent trials. But he also added, generally a good idea for an independent statistician to replicate the results. The FDA will conduct a thorough evaluation of data collection, endpoint adjudication, and statistical analysis, and they will have access to all the raw data. The second issue is that the trial was carried out for slightly more than a year. Obesity is a lifelong condition that requires lifelong attention, and all weight loss interventions so far have struggled over the long term. Third, we should not lose track that weight reduction is a surrogate endpoint. Will these reductions in weight translate to reductions in cardiovascular events, and if so, at what cost? I think they will, but we don't know. And no doubt this will be costly therapy. Remember, money spent on one thing means less money spent on other things. I don't have the answers here, but these are the realities of our time. Another issue, adverse effects with this drug are real. Some patients will not tolerate it. It will also take careful dose escalation, and how will that be done and by whom? And finally, philosophically, I have this inkling in my brain that asks, is this a good idea? Should we be chemically inducing people to eat less rather than changing societal norms towards eating better, eating less, and moving more? For instance, when you walk through European cities, it's obvious that obesity is less of a problem there. We could say, let's just recreate that in the US and Canada. That's this little voice in my head. Well, I'm going to suppress that voice because it hasn't been working. I've been working in Kentucky for 2+ decades, watching obesity just sicken and kill people. It's terrible. Now, if this sort of weight loss through a weekly injection can be sustained, there are millions of humans who could benefit. Often, people struggling with obesity need that initial kick. Something happens and many of these people are transformed and they don't go back. I've seen this happen and it's wonderful. So I'm going to stay optimistic about a potential medical breakthrough for a major medical problem. It's early, but this is very, very promising data. Please let me know what you think about the semaglutide data. I'm sure we'll learn more as more studies come out. Well, I just realized that I've carried on for almost 20 minutes. But before I sign off, let me recommend the latest column from Melissa Walton Shirley. She comments on the terrible decision to fire a doctor who decided to vaccinate 10 strangers and acquaintances with soon-to-expire Moderna COVID-19 vaccine. Melissa's a superb writer. You'll love her essay. Also, my tribute to Dr. Bernard Lown is now up on the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology. And next week, I'll have coverage of a big AF screening study published in JAMA. So that's it for this week in cardiology. As always, I am grateful that you listened. Thank you. And remember, please, if you like this podcast, it really, really helps to give us a rating, write us a little review so that others can find us. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.